Hey all, my name is Nicole Cagna, and I am the host of Dominion TV's Ask the Prophet, where we actually answer the hard questions. When the Lord designed this show, He wanted it to be a safe place where His church and His bride could ask the hard questions without judgment. And the last couple of years, we have obliged. Watch us live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Dominion TV. And don't forget to download the app and become a partner. You will never regret sowing. Welcome, guys. Happy New Year. It's 2025. Thank you, Jesus. I'm so happy to be here with you guys today. I know we have had some prophetic words, and we've had some things going on, and it is nice to get back into a routine with you guys where we are back weekly on Ask the Prophet every Wednesday at 11 a.m. And I really felt led to choose this question, led by the Lord, because we are going to talk about something that people don't like to talk about or admit that they struggle with, and that is anxiety. Okay. And in particular, I think that we tend to think that we are anxious because we're so busy and all of these things, but really there's a deeper reason. And sometimes people can even be anxious and not realize that they're storing it in their bodies. And so there's a lot about anxiety that tends to not be discussed because we look at anxiety as something that is external, meaning it's something that you could see on people. And that may be true in some circumstances, but I think the reality is many of us carry some things that we're not letting go, and we don't realize it. And perhaps this was just our personality type is what we're taught. Oh, well, you're type A. And listen, I get it. As a former workaholic and type A kind of person, business, like let's do this, let's go. I didn't realize how much that I actually took with me wherever I went. And so sometimes anxiety could look like you're falling apart, but many times I would say anxiety in high functioning people is kind of hiding and simmering underneath some of the surfaces. And I think it's important that we actually discuss anxiety. And I recently did a podcast on this topic, very similar on this topic in my Wonder Woman Leadership Academy, because the holidays typically brings about a lot of anxiety because there's a lot of expectations. So we're going to get into that today. So welcome, guys. Hey, Emily, welcome, guys. I'm going to ask that you share this broadcast for those who are watching now or those who are catching the replay. If you would please share this, because this is definitely a topic that we need to understand in the body of Christ. Because you know what? It's not faith to avoid these things. And, I'm all about root systems, and I'm all about fruit and root. Like, I'm just like, let's not ignore it. Let's turn the lights on. Let's find out, like a spiritual surgeon, where it is, and let's remove it with the blood of Christ. Because I really believe this, in this 2-part series, you're going to recognize that there's some things that you might be carrying that you never realized was something that you were meant to leave at the cross. So here's the question. This person wrote, I noticed that every year during the holidays, so this person, usually, honestly, these kind of questions take a little time, but this was a few weeks. So the Lord really kind of highlighted it. And it says, I noticed that every year during the holidays, I become extremely overwhelmed and anxious with all that needs to be done. I tend to get overwhelmed and anxious over a busy week or even major tasks. How do I live a life free from anxiety? That's a loaded question. That's why we have two parts. So I get it because as a mom and, during the holidays, a lot of times, mothers are tasked with making magic, is what we call it. And I think it's important to make sure that you have communication with your partner. I do. I have communication. So we make sure that we divide labor equitably. I think that's important. Otherwise, it's one person carrying everything. And so we have to be realistic also with expectations and understand that if you're doing it all, you are going to be anxious because one person was not meant to do it all. And so that's where we have to kind of have some wisdom. So I want you to understand what anxiety is because it comes from the mind. Okay, so anxiety will come from the mind in the way that we think about a situation. So anxiety, in essence, is really a form of fear. So you have a strong man, and if the strong man is fear, if that's the overarching, spirit that you're dealing with, underneath that, it's going to, what's the word, manifest itself as anxiety. And it tends to come from things like, well, what if this? Or, well, what if I can't get it all done? Or what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Or if then I'm stuck in this way and all of that. We kind of get in our heads about it. So now all of a sudden we're dealing with a thought. We're dealing with what we call a vain imagination, and vain imaginations need to be cast down. So anxiety tends to be a thought. It can begin with this thought that enters, and you have to decide in that moment, is that your thought or is that a vain imagination? Because not all thoughts are your thoughts. Does that make sense? Not all thoughts are yours, and we tend to believe that all thoughts are ours, especially if we're looking at it from our own voice, meaning sometimes there's a thought and you think that it belongs to you, but it's really been just implanted there by something else. And that voice that you're hearing may not be you. It may be an accusation from a parent, it may be an accusation from somebody else. And so I think that is so important when you're dealing with anxiety, is to understand that just because the thought is there doesn't mean it belongs to you, but you could take authority without taking ownership. Meaning you could take authority over it by telling it where to go, but you don't have to take ownership in the sense of coming into agreement with it. Because once you come into agreement with it, you are allowing it to come inside. Okay. So this new year allows us the opportunity to see where we can improve. So I want to share because you could look at 2024 in a couple of ways. You could look at it like, gosh, I didn't get everything that I wanted to get done, right? So a lot of people are like, man, 2024, I didn't, they're not looking at where they came from. They're looking at what they didn't do that they set out to do. And let's be honest, 2024 was not what we expected in the sense that there was still a lot more purging and a lot more battles that we had to endure. But it brought about a preparation and a purity to receive what God has for us in this current season. And so I want you to understand that anxiety comes from placing, also, by the way, unrealistic expectations on ourselves and others. So, first of all, I want you to understand that we place these unrealistic expectations on ourselves, especially as women. um, Women tend to do this in certain areas. If you're compassionate or if you're a minister, whether you're a man or a woman, and you're a minister, you're always going to look and feel, you're going to remember the one person maybe that you didn't reach as a minister, whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter, because your heart is a heart of Christ. And if you love people and you love Jesus, and you love to do the work of the Lord, we tend to take a look at our outcome and our output, right? And we tend to evaluate ourselves on a very different scale than we evaluate others. So there's two kinds of anxiety. There's an anxiety that comes from internal, and then there's anxiety that's external. Okay. And so a lot of times we tend to, as ministers, we tend to be very hard on ourselves. We tend to not show grace. So we have no problem showing grace to other people, but we can't show grace to ourselves. That's a problem. That's where we become, and this was the prophetic word as well that I released, that was replaying, had to do with, are you a Pharaoh in your own life? So when you are your own Pharaoh, when you are a tyrant in your own life, you are going to open the door for fear, and you're going to open the door for anxiety, because you're evaluating yourself on a scale that is not God's measure. And that's where that comes from. So it is easy to forgive others. And I remember, that I struggled with that too. I when I do something wrong, or if I hurt somebody unintentionally, I am just like heartbroken over that, because my heart is to love and to heal, and to so if I am short, or if I am whatever, having a rough day, and I'm not the nicest, I tend to evaluate myself, and just really come with a repentant heart. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think that if it stays with you and you're constantly in this cycle of self condemnation rather than self realization, there's a difference. So, realization is, hey, I had a hard day and I took it out on you, and I am so sorry for that. And I'm going to do better, and I'm going to manage. It's my responsibility to manage myself. It's my responsibility to manage my own feelings. It's not other people's responsibility. And so, when I apologize like that. That's my apology. I'm never just like, sorry. I really, because I truly believe that in order for reconciliation to occur, it has to be something genuine. But then I have to leave it there, because my tendency, if I'm not careful, will be to apologize again because I feel so badly about it. And so I learned over the years in my maturity to apologize, and then realize, if God has forgiven me, and I have repented, and that's it. I've done what I can do, right? And so then I have that choice whether or not I'm going to continue to allow the enemy to come in and condemn me, or I'm going to say, if God doesn't remember it anymore, then why should I? Do you see? Because I've already taken accountability for my action. And I think that we have to not continuously beat ourselves up. And so we tend to look at the goals that we're setting, and evaluate goals that we're setting as well. So not just emotional and relational goals, but also ministry goals or business goals. And sometimes the goals that we set are unrealistic. So again, this is where we're like, okay, if there was multiple Nicoles, that would be possible. If there were multiple me's, I would be able to counsel people one-on-one, while making messages, while running a business, while having a family. If there were multiple me's, I would be able to have coffee with every person that wanted to have coffee with me, and counsel and all of that. But that's not possible, because that's not my life. That's not what it looks like. And there's only one individual. The Lord has given me a specific assignment, and it is not a one-on-one assignment. And so if I begin to allow what others want from me to become my measure of success, then I am always going to fail. And when we do that, that is where anxiety comes in, because while it's important to set goals, and while it's important to have an idea of what we want to accomplish, and to sit with the Lord and talk about what must be accomplished, we also have to understand and be realistic with what we can do in the season that we are in. So when I was, raising Christian, and he was little, And I had to make everything handmade because the kid had eczema so badly that I had to make laundry detergent. And I was like a pioneer woman. That's not the same season that I'm in. That has shifted. And so there are things that as seasons shift, you're going to outsource certain things. So now we, of course, purchase, scent-free laundry detergent. And now we purchase soap and stuff like that. But when he was little, that's what I used to do. And that is a different season. I can't do that anymore. That's the Lord moved me away from that and said, now you could purchase these things. And if I were to try to do the things that I did when Christian was 3 years old, and now he's going to be 13, I would fail at everything. I wouldn't be able to do anything well because I would be spreading myself too thin. So anxiety can come from unrealistic expectations for ourselves, but also if we allow other people's expectations to become ours, that's where anxiety is created. So I will always be a person that believes I will, this is me, and I know this about me, that I could accomplish 20 things in a certain amount of hours. And I'm not always realistic about how long something is going to take. I think I'm hopeful, but I'm not always realistic. And so knowing that, I bring my list to God and I'm like, kind of like a little kid sometimes. I'm like, hey, dad, I go to him as a father and I'm like, what do you think about this? Can I do all this with you? Because I know you say all things are possible, but we be trying to tell God his word sometimes. I'm like, you said all things are possible. And he's like, so sometimes he'll say, babe, I really want you to focus on these two things. And that's your focus. And if you get to the other things, great. But if not, leave it. And then there is this sense of certainty that I have, like, okay, Lord, he's letting me know. And so the results sometimes, if we don't consult with God about what his expectations are for 2025, what his expectations are for our ministry, what his expectations are for our business, what his expectations are for our relationships, then we will feel anxious and anxiety will come. And it might not be externally, but it might be internally, because now we're creating a war within ourselves. And that internal anxiety is a result of our thought life, unrealistic expectations, and a measuring scale that is not the Lord's. Do you see how this works, guys? So that is internal anxiety. And then we get mad at everybody else. I know how y'all think I'm going to do all this stuff. And you get mad at people like, I didn't tell you to do, like, what? Like, what? Nobody, ain't nobody tell you that you had to make 10 necklaces. Like, and nobody told you that you had to plan the whole month in one day. Sometimes we do it and we're just, like we're just grouchy, we're walking around. And I'm just like, that's just not the way. Let's do better, guys. Let's do better. We could do better than we've done before. So external anxiety is different. And external anxiety and internal anxiety are different, because internal anxiety comes from our thought life, what we think other people are going to think about us, what we decide to do, what we decide not to do, and how we feel about things. But external anxiety comes from things like financial difficulty or health. Especially anxiety could be something that's coming where your body is not doing what you want it to do and you're struggling. I know for me right now in the season that I'm in, I'm just coming off of, about 13 days of a nasty sinus infection. And my last day of antibiotics was yesterday. And it was not the way that I wanted to spend the last 10 days of my break. And I didn't want to be a spreader. So I ended up kind of isolating up in my bedroom so I wouldn't get my guys sick. And then once things kicked in, I was able to, to come out maybe with 2 days left of vacation. And that was not how I wanted to spend it. And I was sad about that, but that was not something that I could control. So the anxiety that I began to feel as I was counting down the days of losing out on this family time that I was looking forward to created this external feeling that I had to hand to the Lord and go, all I could do is pray and trust, oh God, that you will restore what the locusts have eaten. That is what I believe, and that's what I could do. And so that's what I gave to the Lord, because I realized I was feeling a certain kind of way about something that I cannot control. Okay. And so external anxiety is also finances as well. So if you're struggling financially, I remember there was a season in life where Chris and I were in New York, and things were very, very bad. I had just gotten diagnosed with Addison's disease, and there's just the amount of tests and medications, and everything was so expensive, even with insurance. And it was just so hard. And I just remember doing my best, and Chris doing his best as a couple to try to mitigate and trust in the Lord. But we couldn't, we had to keep dropping it off at the cross because there was nothing more that we could do with the time and the space that we were given. And so we had to give that anxiety over, because that was not something that had to do with our inner thought life necessarily. It had to do with, oh gosh, where are our groceries going to come from? And where we had to trust in the Lord. Even friendships that are at odds could bring external anxiety, because you are now feeling a certain kind of way about how somebody else is treating you. Okay. It also comes by saying yes to everything. So I remember when I was diagnosed 12 years ago with Addison's disease, I would ignore my body and its signals, and I would overextend myself. And the result would mean that I was bedridden for days or hospitalized with an Addison's crisis. And the reason why I was hospitalized is because I pushed my body. I didn't listen to its cues, because I wanted to be the person that I was before the diagnosis. And what I was doing is I was calling it faith, but it wasn't. It was avoidance. I didn't want to deal with the disease. I wanted to pretend that it didn't exist. And as a result of that, I pushed myself. And the Lord was like, did I tell you to say yes to these things? And this was 12 years ago. And I'm like, no, maybe. Did you? I don't, was I sleepy? Because maybe I wasn't paying attention. Okay, you did not tell me. And the Lord's like, mm-hmm. So we had to have some heart to heart conversations, because I was saying yes, because I love well, and I'm an acts of service love language. So when I love you, I want to do, because that's my personality. I want to show you how I feel by being present. And there were times where I just could not. And I had to learn how to put boundaries up, because all that did was create stress on my body, and that anxiety didn't help. And so that's anxiety overall. These are the things where we see it in our lives. We see it externally, we see it internally. But how do we overcome anxiety? How do we overcome it? The first step, and this is probably going to take up a majority of our meeting today, our show today, because we're going to hit the other stuff most likely next week. But the emotions, guys, can I just tell you, this is such a big deal. This is something that we really don't teach in the body of Christ, that we so desperately need to understand. And that is my heart in sharing this. The first thing is that anxiety happens to be common. Okay. So I'm not saying that we accept it, but I'm saying that you're not unique in your struggle. We have all struggled with anxiety, whether you are, a Christian for 40 years, whether you're a prophet, a pastor. We have all had experiences where we have felt anxiety, and it's a common struggle that people face. I mean, even as Christians, we are not immune to these feelings, but God does offer us a peace that surpasses all understanding. So the first thing that we have to know when we're trying to overcome anxiety as a born again Christian is to understand that we're called to bring it to God, not avoid it and call it faith, but bring it to God. You don't want to ignore it. You want to acknowledge it. So, step number one would be this. Step number one would be I'm going to acknowledge the anxiety that I'm feeling. And then after that, I want to go further. Don't just acknowledge the anxiety, write it down. I know that sounds strange, but this is what I've helped people with in inner healing and deliverance. Write down, what is it that's making you anxious? There's something powerful about when you write something on a piece of paper. All of a sudden, it it becomes something that is manageable. It becomes something that's smaller almost in a way because it's on paper. And now you're faced with it and you're like, okay, here it is. Now the next step is to say, this thing that I'm feeling anxious about, is it external or is it internal? Meaning, is this something that I'm doing to myself, or is this a result of my thought life? Or is this something that I can't control? So, if it's something that has to do with finances or your health, you may say, Lord, I am bringing this to you. Okay, I'm bringing this to the Lord, and the Lord is going to open up doors, right? So I'm going to do First Peter 5:7, where I cast my anxiety on him because he cares. Do you remember that old song in church? Gosh, I remember it. I cast all my cares upon you. Do you remember that song? Maybe you do. And I lay all of my burdens down at your feet. And anytime I don't know what to do. Do you remember that? I will cast all my cares upon you. I remember that singing that when I was little, 3, 4, 5 from church. And because we didn't have children's church, we had a hard wooden pew and we sat in that thing for a couple hours. Pentecostal, raised Pentecostal. So I remember hearing that, and I just kept remembering that was First Peter 5:7. So whenever I feel anxiety, I always hear that hymn. And I think of First Peter 5:7. I'm going to cast my cares. And first, I'm going to acknowledge, is this something that is created from my thought life? Or is this something that I'm frustrated with because it hurts? Because listen, when you're in chronic pain or you're struggling with a chronic illness, it hurts. If you're going through a divorce and it's something that is lasting a long time and it's drawn out, it isn't easy. If you're a single parent, but and you're like, listen, I didn't ask for this. I thought, when you get married, you think it's going to be forever. You're like, I'm a single parent. I didn't ask for this, but now everything's on you and you're trying to work and you're trying to raise a child or children or grandchildren, whatever it is. There's things that are external, and God's not like, get over it. God loves you. He cares for you. He wants you to put it on him. He wants you to drop it. So listen, the thing is, with something external, you could drop it off at the cross, but we still should also bring our internal anxiety to God, but in a different way, because it's not like you're dropping off, a specific burden. External things you drop off at the cross, but internal anxiety, you bring yourself. Okay. So external is, okay, I'm wearing this burden of, chronic illness. So let me drop this off at the cross and say, God, I could do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's right. All things, even hard things, I can do it. God has called me to it. He's going to get me through it. And you speak life over yourself, right? You speak life over it and you drop it off and you trust. But when it's you drop yourself off, but you have to emerge from that spot. So you're bringing yourself to the cross, but you're staying there till the work is done. Do you see what I'm saying? Eventually you're going to emerge, but you're staying there. So you could be intentional in examining the reason why you feel anxious, and understand that the only way to renew your mind is to place yourself at the foot of the cross and at the feet of Jesus in intimacy. Whenever I am going through inner turmoil or anxiety about a situation, and listen, sometimes an external thing you could drop at the cross, like health issues, but then there's a trigger or something that you're feeling about those health issues that you then also have to deal with. So something could be both internal and external at the same time, because it could be how you think about chronic illness, or how you think about your finances, or how you think about your prodigal, or how you think about your grandchild. What are you not releasing to the Lord? What are you holding on to? The other thing is you have to engage with the Lord. Ask him. Okay. I do this all the time. This is such a great way to process feelings. And maybe when you grew up, there really wasn't, you didn't learn about feelings. Sometimes growing up, I'm Gen X, we had a generation before us whose parents weren't necessarily, the touchy-feely, emotions kind. I would say that now today's generation of kids are, they need a safe place to cry kind of thing. Like, that's a little too much, I think. But I think we've gone a little too far in the other direction where everything's about feelings. But there's a healthy balance. So you have to ask the Lord. Maybe you grew up not knowing why you're feeling a certain kind of way. Or maybe you grew up when your parents, you were upset, you're crying, your parents, I'll give you something to cry about. You crying to get in the slipper. Oh, you cry, I'll give you something to cry about. And you're like, and so that if you grew up in that kind of mindset, it doesn't, like, that's all your parents knew. It doesn't mean that it was necessarily the right thing, but it doesn't mean that it was abusive. But it probably means that maybe you grew up not knowing, that you were taught in a way subconsciously to stuff your feelings down because nobody had time for it, because people were busy, they were working, they just didn't have time for walking you through that. So when that happens, we tend to sometimes not understand. And so we have what's called a masking emotion. And I want to get into that. A masking emotion is anger. That's a perfect masking emotion, right? It is something that people kind of resort to when they don't know how to process their feelings. So you have to engage with the Lord in order to overcome anxiety. And what that looks like is saying, what's happening? I do this all the time. Lord, if I'm feeling a certain kind of way, and Chris is having a late night at work. He's a vice principal now, and so he has games, a couple of nights a week where he's out till 10 o'clock at night. And so if I'm running around, I don't always have time to process everything. And so I take it in my private time with the Lord, which is why the secret place matters so much. Or if I'm feeling a certain kind of way in a moment, I'll excuse myself and I will process, because I know that I need to, because I also know that I am very verbally, I am very quick-witted, and I know how to debate up one side and down the other of a person. And it's because I know that about me, and I know that that's a gift that I have, but it could also be used in a way that is not productive. So knowing that when I'm feeling a certain kind of way, and it takes a lot to really honestly make me angry, like a lot. Usually it has to do with an injustice, and usually it has to do with somebody else. So I'll get mad about somebody. I'll get mad at what somebody else is going through, and I bring it to warfare prayer. That's where a lot of my intercession goes. I'm like, oh, devil, no. You gonna get your hands off this family, especially over my friends' families and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't think so, devil. I'm like, no. So that's one thing. But sometimes if I'm feeling a certain kind of way, I say, Lord, what's going on here? What is happening? Why am I feeling this way? That's my favorite question, is why. It always has been since I was little. Why? What am I feeling? What is this? What is this, Lord? I feel angry, but why am I angry? What's making me angry? And what's the underlying emotion? And I'll sit on the bed with the Lord. I've done this for, goodness, probably almost 20 years now. And I'll say, what is this, Lord? And the Lord will actually answer me, because he's that good. And he'll say, well, honey, The anger is the masking emotion, like, but you're hurt. And I'll say, okay, Lord, but why am I hurt? He'll actually tell me. He'll say, "Well, this happened, and when they said this, it made you feel that." And then I think about it, and I peacefully, like, I write it down, like, "All right, that makes sense. Okay." And once I process it with him, because I'm not trying to bleed over anybody, so I process it. And then he'll explain, I write it down, I process those feelings with him. I forgive whoever needs to be forgiven, whether it's me, whether I have to forgive myself, or whether I have to forgive my spouse or my child or family members, or, a person, who follows the ministry and who was dishonoring and rude or disrespectful, whatever it was. And I have to release it, and then I'm free. I get up and I am free from that burden. I no longer carry it. It's done. And if it's a spouse, I don't ignore it. I sit down, or if it's a friendship, I'll sit down and I will speak. And the way I speak is not emotional, it's the way I'm talking to you, because now I have an understanding about how I feel. And now I understand my reasoning. And so that's where you then become a better communicator, where you can say, when I hear this, or when you said this, it made me feel like this. Or when somebody does this, I feel this. And somebody might say, "Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that was hurtful to you. And I apologize." And do you see how wonderful it is to have this kind of conversation where you can reconcile? Where you can reconcile and really express. All of that is so much better when you're feeling a certain kind of way, because when you're angry, it leads to anxiety. When you're hurt, you're anxious, and you could build walls rather than bridges. We don't want to do that, right? So that's why I say engage with the Lord. Ask him the hard questions. Why am I feeling this way, Lord? Why do I feel overwhelmed? What is it? Sometimes the Lord will tell you, well, you said yes to too many things. It's funny because I remember when my son gets homework, and he'll tell me his homework, and he'll tell me, because he's in advanced classes, and he'll tell me all the things that he has to do. And I'll look at the whole week sometimes. And he does this like me. And he'll be like, "Oh, Mom, I got this whole week ahead of me and I have all this stuff to do." And I'm like, "Oh, he gets that from me," because I'll look at my week and I'm like, "Okay," because it's busy. And I look and I'm like, "Okay." And then I'm like, "Nope, not going to do it." So I help him. I'm like, "Listen, buddy, I tend to do the same thing. You know what? One day at a time. What does the Lord say? Why worry about tomorrow? Today has enough troubles of its own," right? Let's focus on today, but let's not just focus on the troubles. Let's focus on the blessings. And so in teaching him that, I'm also encouraging myself to continue with that, because nobody ever taught me that. I didn't know how to process feelings very well at all. I just used to stuff them, because, you don't know what you don't know when you're growing up. So that's why I say engage with the Lord. The other thing is renew your mind, because an unrenewed mind leads to us becoming the burden. So I want to share about renewing the mind just a little bit, because sometimes when our mind isn't renewed, we end up becoming the burden that we're not meant to be. It's just that we're carrying it. We're carrying things that we're not supposed to, and in carrying it, you're becoming it, because you're enmeshing with it, right? Or you're taking on something. And I noticed that this happens with intercessors in particular as well. If you're an intercessor, you tend to carry, the burden, and you could feel the burden of other people. And I used to struggle with releasing the burden to the cross. The Lord was like, "That's not yours. I know that you're carrying it for somebody else, and that's great, but you got to leave it in prayer, Nicole. You can't carry it. I died on the cross so you wouldn't have to." And so I had to learn to leave it there. So sometimes we carry people, we carry things. It's not realistic. And if you have, I want you to understand that We are supposed to be becoming more like Christ, not becoming the burden that we carry because of an unrenewed mind. So we're supposed to be becoming in our fruit, in our words, in our actions, mature, renewed, transformed, transfigured. But if you have anxiety, you have a house that's divided, because a house divided against itself can't stand. You cannot have the Prince of Peace in the same space as fear. It's not going to happen. One has to go, and you have to decide which one that is going to be. Because a lot of Christians are walking around divided because they don't know what to do with how they feel. And they believe that if they just ignore the anxiety and if they pretend it doesn't exist, that's faith, right? But that's not faith, that's avoidance. And avoidance, believe it or not, is a tactic of the enemy. He loves to leave the lights off. And I'm saying turn the lights on. Because if we're a city on a hill, a light that's meant to shine, arise and shine, your light has come, then why are we sweeping things under the rug? Why are we hiding things in the darkness, pretending that it doesn't exist? No, I don't think so. I'm turning the light on. I'm turning the light on. I'm going to examine my heart. I'm turning the light on. I'm going to examine my spirit. I'm turning the light on. I'm going to examine my flesh. What am I carrying that can't come with me? What is it that I'm subconsciously? I ask the Lord every night, search my heart, oh God, every day, every night. Purge it. What is it? Can I just tell you, I was like, Lord, I better stop asking that prayer, because there's stuff that will come out, but it's good because you're not supposed to walk around with it. And listen, there's been some poor teachings over the course of decades that makes you think that somehow acknowledging your feelings that are not favorable means somehow you lack faith, but that's not true. In reality, we call it transparency. We call it authenticity. Because along with transparency comes authenticity, and along with authenticity comes maturity. If you are simply regurgitating the same messages and the same phrases, and you just keep saying the same thing, I'm gonna get through, and it's almost like you have a language. I call it Christianese, ESE at the end. It's a Christianese language, and we do it all the time. But I'll get through. No, don't minimize what you're going through. Guess what? God could handle it. Even Jesus was like, hey, can you pass the cup from me? Is there any other way? I mean, we've all been there. So eventually, if you don't acknowledge it, you can't mature. Guys, you can't mature in the faith based on what you don't acknowledge. Like, you cannot do it. You can't mature in an area that you refuse to acknowledge. You'll never mature if you have a bunch of things that just lay there unacknowledged. You sweep it under the rug, you hide it, but eventually somebody's going to turn on the lights, or a situation is going to turn on the lights, or somehow, some way, you're going to be bumbling around in the dark. And with that mound that you keep sweeping under that rug, you're going to trip. You trip and you stumble. Why? Because it wasn't dealt with. That's why this is not about condemnation. Come on, Cindy. Come on, Abby. Come on, Lisa. This is not about ignoring. Okay? You can't mature in that way. It wasn't dealt with. So that's why we need to do what? The next step is to understand that you have to confront unfavorable feelings. That's your next step in overcoming anxiety. And I want to share something with you. This is very important. This is revelation, what I'm about to tell you. And it might be hard to hear, but you can handle it. Unresolved grief leads to anxiety. I can tell you, my goodness, it is so true. People tend to avoid unfavorable feelings because of trauma or childhood, things like that. Maybe, again, your feelings weren't welcome. All right. Maybe, you had to be more quiet because everybody else was more loud or dramatic. Maybe it was a chaotic household. There's just tons of reasons. Maybe you felt like there wasn't any space in your life for you to have feelings because you were so busy surviving your childhood. that forget the other things. You had to push those things aside just to survive. And I can tell you that when you're living in survival mode, it is very difficult to heal because there's these unresolved things that you have no choice but to push aside until you're ready, have until you have that space to feel it and to deal with it. And so, trauma, what happens is trauma creates a scenario where we tend to bury or avoid. Okay, we tend to bury or avoid feelings. Now, I remember when my daughter died, when Eve passed away. Many of you know I gave birth to twins, and my daughter Eve passed away of trisomy 13, February 29th, the day after her birth. And I remember specifically saying to the Lord, when am I supposed to grieve? Because I had basically died on the table. I lost half the blood in my body. I saw the light. I was going up, 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 up. And then I heard the verbal voice of the Lord, the audible voice telling me, get back and fight, wake up and fight. And so I did. But when I got home, I was a wreck. I mean, I had pneumonia. I had lost my child. I had a blood transfusion and an emergency C-section. I was so sick. When was I going to grieve? Okay. I had bleeding stitches, a newborn that had colic. Christian at the time had colic, by the way. So he screamed and cried. My husband had no choice but to go back to work because we needed the medical insurance, because we all know that I would love to see America do better with maternity and paternity leave. That's for sure. So at the time I was surviving. There was no way when was I going to process it? In that moment, I can't say that was my fault that I didn't process it. No, there is no fault. And that's why I'm saying there's no condemnation here. There might be grief that you never really dealt with it. And sometimes people are like, oh, well, when I get saved, I became a new creation. Yes, you did. Yes. But that doesn't mean that your body didn't keep the score. And so that's why we have to deal with grief, because I promise you, if you don't deal with trauma, it will bleed into your current relationships. And you will begin to treat people that are in your current relationships ways that you're not supposed to, or misunderstand them because you're looking through the lens of trauma because it had never been dealt with. And so I remember feeling like, wow, that was the reality. I was in survival. But the funny thing about it is that I couldn't be faulted for not dealing with it then, right? But this is how the enemy works. At one point, there comes a point where I chose not to deal with it at all. And that's where the enemy got a leg up. And then I cut it off because I went for inner healing and deliverance. And I'm telling you that when I chose that, I mean, listen, I chose at one point to ignore it because it just felt like there's just no space for it. So what's happening is then I'm in it, but I don't know I'm in the pit. So I'm in this pit, but I don't know it. I'm in this pit and I'm filled with grief, but I'm not going through the grieving process because I'm stuck. And that's where God shows up. That's where God showed up. And I shared with you, he was like, are you going to tell me how you feel about what I didn't do? And that's where we had to have a real conversation. So I want to encourage you, if there's some unresolved grief in your life, that could lead to anxiety. Now, healing the grief is part one. So once you heal the grief, then you have to deal with the anxiety. Okay. So I want to share with you what this looked like in my life. That's why there's transparency. So I told you that I couldn't deal with it when I brought Christian home. But when he was a toddler, I had to deal with it, because even when you don't realize that you're subconsciously stuffing your feelings and emotions, God knows. And God will say, hey, there's something going on here. Let's talk about it. Right? That's how good he is. He gets it. He'll never ask you to deny your fear. He's never going to ask you to deny your grief. And the reality was this: I carried an anxiety, right? And it wasn't, oh, I lost my daughter. That was the grieving process that I was avoiding. But what birthed from avoidance was a very traumatic level of fear that something was going to happen to my son. So now I was panicking. I was living in a constant state of anxiety because I lost my daughter and because they were twins. And because after Addison's, I was told I would not be able to have any more children. As a result of that, I felt like this is all I have. So this is where God, God's not saying, oh, pretend that you're not afraid that your son is going to struggle or that something's going to happen to him. That's not it. God didn't say, oh, just have faith, right? God didn't say any of those things. Do you want to know what God did in that moment? God asked the hard questions. So you have grief, right? And then from grief, unresolved grief, comes anxiety, which is the stronghold of fear that was birthed because I lost my daughter. And now I am trying to protect my son. So God spoke to me and he said, Nicole, do you believe that I love Christian more than you? I'm sorry, what? In my head, I was like, but I'm a mom. And he's like, but I'm God. I wanted to say yes. I really did. At that time, I wanted to say yes, but instead I said no. And he said, why do you say that? And I had to examine. That was hard. And I'm like, because look what you let happen to Eve. There it was. And if you let that happen to Eve, I'm afraid that you're going to do the same thing to my son. That's what I said to him. Because you saw fit to allow my daughter to die, I feel like I can't trust you with my child. I'm being completely real with you. And you see, there it was. There was the root. And once I saw it, I realized that I was charging God foolishly. I was saying, hey, you allowed this to happen. You allowed me to get sick. You allowed me to not have more babies. You allowed, my daughter to, like, you allowed all these things. So guess what? This is mine. I didn't even know that that was what I was doing. Right. And so I said, who is to say that you won't take any more from me? I was in such a Job season. That's the crushing that I talk about when I say there's crushing. There's crushing. The oil is not cheap. So I said that, Lord, who's to say that you won't take any more from me? And you know what I had to do, guys? I had to sit at the cross. I had to sit, kneel, actually, is what I did, with my face to the floor and sobbed and let all of it come out because I had to work through forgiveness. I had to work through forgiveness. Not that God needs my forgiveness, but I needed to forgive him for not releasing him of the expectations of how I wanted him to behave in my life, how I wanted him to act, what I wanted him to do. And so I had to understand that my root of fear was from lack of trust because it was partnering with trauma and grief from the death of a child at the same time. Do you see how this works? This is the strategy. I'm telling you, I've lived it, I've seen it, and I'm sharing it with you so you can recognize how the enemy tries to work in our lives. God will never ask you to ignore your feelings. He's going to ask you to do the hard thing. See, avoiding your feelings and ignoring them, that's the easy thing. But he's going to ask you to acknowledge your feelings and trust that he cares about what we're going through. That's what he's going to ask you guys. He's going to want you to believe him and trust that we're going to avail ourselves of First Peter chapter 5:7, that we will truly cast our anxieties on him because he cares for us. See, when we read that verse, we're like, oh yeah, cast all my cares. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But do you see how I have evidence that I was not doing that? And am I charging myself like, oh, Nicole, you should have? No, I know what I was walking through. That's just called healing. And healing is messy, right? Healing is messy, right? And so if we want to overcome anxiety, we have to understand that we have to deal with the messiness of emotions, which is why I wanted this part 1 to be all about emotions, because you can't cast something out that you refuse to deal with, because trauma is not necessarily a spirit. Right? There can be a spirit, but trauma is something that is not your fault. It's something that you experienced that was done to you. It's not, there's no blame here. There's no like, oh, no, it's something that has to be dealt with though, because you don't want it. See, it's going to be a weapon either way. It's going to be a weapon in the hand of the enemy to stifle you and destroy you, or it could be a weapon in your hand, right? To set people free. It could be a key in your hand to unlock and set the captives free, to go into the enemy's camp and to take every person that has suffered and throw them over your shoulder and go, peace out. I'm out. Bye. And walk out with those people over your back because you have the key. And then you say, here, and you give them the key. And then they go, and then they unlock, and they go into the enemy's camp. And that's how people get saved. That's what we're called to do in Isaiah 6. Oh, come on. I'm telling you, we're supposed to set the captives free. And I want you to understand that what you're going through, what you're going through it was meant to destroy you, but it's going to be a survival guide for somebody else. And that's not to make you feel warm and fuzzy about your suffering, because there is nothing fun about suffering. There is nothing fun about grief and loss and abuse and death, all of that. There's nothing fuzzy and warm and cozy about it. And I'm not going to make it that way, but I'm going to tell you what, it's a key, and it's a weapon. And I like weapons. I really like weapons. I really do. I actually was trained in weapons and mixed martial arts. Let me just tell you, I was trained in weapons, and in the spirit realm, I'm also trained in weapons. And I'm also looking at my life and I'm like, Lord, use my story for your glory. Use what the enemy called to try to take me down. There were times where I was on that floor crying out, Lord, Lord, but I want babies, Lord, but I wanted my life to look different. I feel like my story of motherhood was stolen, Lord. And the enemy said, that's right, it was. Stay down. And I got up and I put my hand down and I said, I'm getting up. And oh boy, I was limping, but I was walking with a limp, but I got up. I wrestled and I got up, and I walked with a limp, but I was struck down, but I was not destroyed. I got back up. And if I got back up, so could you. And I didn't just get back up. No. See, I got equipped. And then after I got equipped, I began equipping others. And that's where I'm here today. So guess what? That thing that you're looking to avoid can actually be the pathway to walk you into your destiny. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the what? The word of our testimony. So overcoming anxiety looks like so much more than we think, because we have to deal with the emotions that we refuse to acknowledge. We just want to say it's under the blood, it's under the blood, it's under the blood. Yes, it is, but you got to deal with it. Okay? You have to still deal with it. And it'll still stay under the blood, but you got to deal with it, because your body, your flesh, sometimes keeps the score. Amen. So what we're going to talk about next week, we're going to talk about, because we talked about the emotions. Now we're going to talk about how to overcome anxiety by replacing worry with prayer, and then even prayer strategies we're going to talk about. There's a lot that we're going to talk about next week, but I wanted to spend time with your feelings, right, guys? I wanted to sit with you. I wanted to sit with you with this. Come on. That's right. Revelation 12:11. That's how we triumph. That's how we triumph. Amen. All right, guys, listen. I take it to the last minute. I know that I do. But if you are watching, I'm going to ask that you please share this broadcast. I'm talking so fast here because I'm trying to wrap it up. But I want you to share. Please share, because people need to understand this. They need this message in the body of Christ. If you have any questions, you can email me at thebridalcallministries@gmail.com. Tune in for part 2 next week. You are not going to want to miss it. Amen. I'll see you next week. Bye. Hey y'all, my name is Nicole Cagna, and I am the host of Dominion TV's Ask the Prophet, where we actually answer the hard questions. When the Lord designed this show, He wanted it to be a safe place where His church and His bride could ask the hard questions without judgment. And the last couple of years, we have obliged. Watch us live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Dominion TV. And don't forget to download the app and become a partner. You will never regret sewing.
Hey guys, have you remembered to sow your partnership seed this month? No? Come on now. Take your phone out and go to the app and sow your best seed right there on the app, or take a moment and go to the website and sow your best seed right there on the giving tab. We need your help here at Dominion TV. With your help and your prayers, we continue to carry the gospel of the kingdom around the world. And those of you that have not been given, or maybe you gave before and you haven't given lately, come on and help us now. I'm calling for you. I'm sending out a message now. Come on and help us here at Dominion TV, because with your help, we're going to do even more and do it with a greater spirit of excellence, because the kingdom of God deserves excellence. And I believe you're a part of making that happen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for giving. Thank you for your generosity. Take time right now and sow your monthly seed. If you haven't been partnering, now's the time to partner. We love you. Thank God for you. Keep watching Dominion TV. And remember, you deserve to reign in life.
This ministry is able to fulfill the mandate and command of Jesus to carry the gospel of the kingdom into all the world by the faithful support of people just like you. Give online at www.dominion.tv/giving. Here you will find various ways to give, including DTV's PayPal, Zelle, Cash App, and Venmo giving platforms. You can also securely give and partner with us with your credit or debit card and set up your weekly or monthly recurring seed. You can also give by text with your mobile phone. Simply text the word GIVE to 704-817-2843 and follow the prompts for giving securely. If you choose to mail your offering, you can send that to the Ministries mailbox at Dominion TV, 1000 South Commons Drive, Suite 102, Box 305, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, 29588. On behalf of our founders, Dr. Joseph and Dr. Lynette Dutton, may the Lord bless you richly is our prayer.